goal of any journey is to improve yourself. So how far have I come? I've been painting miniatures since I was 16 and got my first Space Marine and paint set. And you know that was a long time ago because those paints still had the screw off caps. But I always kept that model. It was a Space Marine biker. I painted it black with blue tiger stripes, and even put a little symbol I used to doodle in my notebooks on the flag. I think I was going for snow on the base, so that's why it's painted fully white. The one thing I can at least say is the paint's not too thick. I've kept it all these years to always have a reminder of where I got started. Unfortunately at the moment I don't really have any other Space Marine bikers to paint, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit to my first painted army instead. After that first miniature, it actually took me a bit before I stepped into a GW, but once I did and saw what was available to me in this new world of miniatures, I immediately fell in love with the Eldar. So my first army that I painted fully was Eldar. So this is technically one of my first painted minis, though after I learned a few things like dry brushing. And if I'm being completely honest, this is the sculpt I still prefer the most, even after 2 new generations of Howling Banshees. So much so that once I progressed a bit in my painting skill, I tried again. This time with a bit more vibrant colors, though still dark. My metallics were a bit cleaner and my contrast a bit more dynamic. A much better effort. But I guess I wasn't actually done there, because at some point I bought even more of these Howling Banshee sculpts that have been in a pile of shame older than some pop stars now. But I'm gonna change that today, for at least one of them, because it's time to go retro 40k and see just how far I've come in 20 or so years. Now I just have to decide on color scheme. Do I go with my black and blue with some updates, or try and follow my more recent Eldar stuff? All my more recent paint jobs of my Eldar have been in a purple and red scheme, except for Aspect Warriors, which have their main color with a purple underlayer. And I do think a purple and bone would be a really nice color scheme for her, but for a true test of skill, I should go with the original and see exactly what I can do to improve it. I don't think there's that much I want to change about the blue underlayer. Just execute it a bit better with a bit better blending techniques, and maybe warm up the shadows a bit with a splash of red. I'll start with a dark base blue to get something to work from. I plan on making these pants pretty dark overall, so I'm going to start this mix quite dark, but not so dark I can't see the blue tint to it. Base coating all of the under armor with this. One thing about old school Eldar I remember about painting them is it's sometimes pretty difficult to tell what was under armor and what was over, but one thing I found out for certain, hands counted as under armor. I'll start to add that red to the shadows by darkening some red with a little bit of green first, adding just a tiny bit of the blue as well. To get it into the shadows, I'll wet my brush on the sides of the palette, then just dip the tip into the mix, putting the dab of that paint into the area I want to shade and feathering it outward. The next stage is a pretty simple one, because I don't really have to mix anything up for it, because I'm going to go with a pure phthalo blue. I'm not going to want to go much brighter than this, so this is getting applied as if it were a highlight layer, even though it's not that bright, which is actually a nice boon because darker colors like this are a bit easier to get a nice blend with layering. I do want to go a tiny bit lighter since I do want to have some bright highlights on this stuff, but I also want to get some opacity in there. So instead of adding white to lighten it up, I'm actually going to use some of my primer gray. Not a lot, just enough to take me up that half tone. This gets layered in all the general highlight areas, so parts facing my light source, and some of the more sharper edges at the base of the legs and on the hands. Even with really dark colors, they stand out best with contrast, and the best way to get that on this Banshee is going to be adding some more gray into that blue and taking it up just one more step, but this one focused on the highest points and sharpest edges, mostly along the folds of the pants and the edges along stopping points. To really finish off this blending, I'm going to use my airbrush to feather all the highlights out. This is a common thing for me to do when I do higher level painting, as it's kind of the easiest way for me to get nice blends and take much less time to do so. So I add lots of water to the airbrush, then just a little bit of paint, then very gradually build up layers around the highlighted parts so that it smooths the transition from one shade to the next. Water evaporates fast in the quantities that I spray, so it's easy to layer up on a single part continuously until I'm happy with it. Since these are banshees, I want to give them a little bit of an ethereal look, at least in one part. So moving away from the blue that I did on the original, I'm going to make the hair a ghostly mix of shades, building to a white, starting with a base coat of a neutral gray just to lighten things up generally from the start. I'm going to be a little weird about this next part, but weird is fun, right? I'll set up my palette with some raw sienna, raw umber, and phthalo green. I'll mix up some of the umber into both of them just to darken them each up a bit. Then here's the silly part. I'll saturate one brush with some of the sienna and another larger brush with the green. Then holding them evenly together, I'll start using them in tandem to wash the hair and face, stippling mostly and letting the wet paint run into the crevices. The goal is to get a very patchy wash with bits of yellow and bits of green. This will work as an underlayer, which will give the ghostly look to the lighter layers that are going over top. From this underlayer, it's as simple as a few transparent highlight layers to take it home. I'll make a neutral gray with some black and white, something a little more on the white side of things, so a 60-40 instead of a 50-50. This one will become a standard layering layer for the hair. I just want to catch every strand of the hair over the whole length of it. These old models have very sharp hair usually, so it can be easily done with the side of a brush a lot of the time. For the face, I'll control it a little bit more and try and get the paint to pool in the areas I want to appear the brightest, like under the eyes and edges of the howling speakers. Using this same mix, it's time to give the hair the old airbrush treatment like I did with the blue, by just mixing that 60-40 mix into a bunch of water and letting it sink to the base of the cup of the airbrush. With this one, I do get a little bit specific to what I want to highlight with this feathering. And basically, I want to center my spray over the center of the largest clumps of hair. This one doesn't really have that many pronounced clumps, especially on the back here, so I just try my best and imagine which of those clumps are the most pronounced. But on my test mini here, you can see how the style had more waves, and I picked out each of those. The last part is the easiest, and that's just to use some white, thinned with water or medium, to pick out the highlights. I'll focus these highlights the same place I did with the airbrush, picking out the individual strands again where the pale gray is the brightest. This will once again separate those strands out to be a bit more individual. On the face, I focus on the edges and ridges, since it's a bit more mechanical in nature. Black, black, black. Apparently, back in the day, the only thing I thought you needed to paint black was a nice solid black base coat, and you were done. Now I know a little bit better, but I do want to do my best to transfer over the idea of the dark armor to this new model and see if I can't do a black bone, starting by adding raw umber, black, and white to the palette, mixing up the black with the raw umber and some white with the umber as well, keeping it bright but also pretty intense in the saturation. To get these on the plates, I'm going to do a split base coat. One half of each plate is getting the lighter mixture, while the shady half of each of them is getting the darker one. This is basically going to be the setup for my wet blends in the next step. By adding this layer first, I can cover up all the sloppy work I did from the other steps, and gauge where I want the shadows and highlights to go. I'm going to add just a little more white to the bright mix and a little more black to the dark mix, since now I want to wet blend my second layer on these plates, and I want it to have quite a bit of contrast at the start. It'll get toned down later again, but for now I want to be able to see what I'm doing. Then it's a loaded brush wet blend, starting from a corner of the light half on each plate, moving towards the dark. Going slower and starting with the tip of the brush up and then gradually increasing pressure will give the best blends, but it's not a huge deal if they're not perfect at this point, since there's more processing to come after. I want to add some texture and highlight to these plates now, and the good news is I don't have to mix anything new up, since wet blending tends to dull the first color a bit. By using that color again, it'll be a bit more saturated. My plan is to find those bright spots on the armor I made with the last step and reinforce them with some stippling to create a nice texture, including scratches in various places on the plates too, but also highlighting the edges. Just a bit more white now so I can get the really sharp edges near the shoulder armor and reinforcing some of the scratches along the edges of the plates and point highlights. So this is looking a little not black. So I'm going to fix that in this step. And oddly enough, it will not include the airbrush. One of my favorite properties of carbon black is that it can be opaque and transparent all at the same time. So by thinning some of the black and umber mix into a glazed consistency, by evenly painting it over each of the pads, they'll become dark again. And though it looks like I'm just rebase coating them, by the time they dry, you can see all of the texture and highlight underneath, just toned down to the darkness I want it to be. I think when I did the sword the first time around, I threw on some bolt gun and called it a day. One thing that hasn't changed though is that I still prefer metallic to non-metal metal. So I am going to update this sword, but stick with the metallics. First things first is I'm going to introduce some color to the base coat. That starts with some phthalo green, some raw umber, and some of the dark steel. This will add some more of that green I have going on the Banshee's white parts to other parts of the model, so her face doesn't feel so lonely. By adding quite a bit more of the metallic to the mix, I can now pick out which faces I want to be the reflection faces, and on a blade like this, it's usually the sharp edge of the blade. So just a quick swipe down that face on both sides, and it's good to go. With the pure metallic now, I want to pick out a few of the reflection points. One good one is always going to be where the blade curves. This works for non-metal metal too, so if you're ever not sure where to start highlighting a blade, just find the curve and start there. Then I always like to add a second reflection somewhere down the blade. I'm going to do this a little closer to the curve reflection, as the lower part of the blade is going to have some special treatment of its own. On my palette now, I put some medium level steel and a light silver, my mid-tone and highlight respectively. No mixing needed. Starting with the medium steel and a fine brush, I'll paint the lines parallel to the edges of the blade in those highlight areas, extending it a bit further down the sharp edges as well. In this case, almost the whole length of the blade. Then adding some water to the brush and wicking it out, I'll feather those areas out just a bit, always lifting my brush in the middle point of the fine lines. Then with some of the light silver, I'll highlight the edges near those reflections and add a bit of extra in the center point of that line highlight to give me my brightest point. Now for even more color, adding some phthalo blue to the palette. I'm going to mix that with just a bit of white and the dark green, then thin it down considerably for a glaze. This glaze then gets pulled from outside the power sword's antenna to the side of it where I let it pool, because this is going to be the area that electricity is going to spark from. So I'll do the same thing again, but this time with a little bit more white in the blue mix, focusing around the edges of the antenna. Using that same color but in a normal consistency, I'll paint the antenna itself with a base coat of that. For each step of this, it's just going to be adding more white to the mix and doing some layering. The antenna gets a dot at the tip and layer towards the middle of the rod, while with a much finer brush, I'm going to paint some lightning streaks, picking a point that starts near the antenna, pulling it out, and adding a branch or two if I feel like it for each particular one. I don't need to go overboard to get the effect, so just 3 or 4 streaks total should be good. With more white, I just repeat the last step, layering it on the antenna and using the fine brush again to highlight those bolts of electricity, starting in the middle of them and following the bolt to either side so that the light point is centered. I also add just a little bit more branching to the bolts with this color, just to get a little bit more texture going. Lastly, with more white in the mix, I pick out the center of each bolt and the antenna, just enough to make the little hot spots at the center of each bolt. To finish the model off, I had to get my current colors in there somewhere, so made the cloth tabard a nice purple, while all the gems and eyes got themselves a red glow via my airbrush, and a layering of oranges. I tried to finish the base as closely to the original as well, but with a much finer sand and a black rim, since that's my taste for these sorts of things now. One thing I can say for certain after all these years is I've definitely developed a style. You get so used to doing things a certain way that it can be hard to change as you progress. So even if I get better at doing a technique, it's still going to have my signature embedded into it. But that's why it's an art. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.